Throughout Sega's life as a hardware developer, they truly struggled to gain third-party support. Third-party support for Sega was at its strongest with the Genesis, but thanks to blunders such as the Sega CD, 32X, Saturn Day, and of course the Bernie Stoller's comments about the Saturn at E3 '97. Because of all this and more, just about all third-party support for Sega had eroded by the time the Dreamcast came around for its short life. Now, for any other company, this lack of third-party support would have been a deal breaker, as without third-party support you can't possibly succeed as a hardware developer. But one of the things that Sega had going for them compared to other failed hardware companies was, for a time, their vast internal development resources. Sega put their in-house development teams to good use in the 8-bit era, a time when Nintendo was locking all its developers into exclusivity agreements. Sega was sometimes able to get the rights from a third-party developer to remake a game for their Master System that was locked into Nintendo's system, as was the case with Ninja Gaiden. And when this wasn't possible, Sega just simply did their own take on it, so they could still offer these gameplay experiences to their fans, even if these games went under a different name, and the best example of this has to be Castlevania. There was no way Sega was going to get this game on their system, or even gotten the rights from Konami to remake it themselves, so Sega just simply made their own Castlevania game and called it Master of Darkness. Simon Belmont, put your whip down because there's a new vampire slayer in town and his name is Dr. Social. So creatures of the night beware, woohoo! You better not mess with him because he's got a pocket knife. Obviously this psychologist is not equipped, in more ways than one, to deal with the forces of darkness. So how did this psychologist get mixed up with Count Dracula? This game's story begins in London in the late 18th century. Now, at that time, London was in the grip of fear of the coming full moon, which would always leave in its wake dead bodies completely drained of their blood, besides the River Thames. Dr. Social suspects something supernatural is behind this, and so he consults the other side with his Ouija board. Ferdinand Social receives a mysterious message which reads, "Killer, vampire, go to Thames, caution, in the wake of Dracula." Wow, not only does London have to deal with werewolves on every full moon, but Count Dracula as well? But then again, who's to say you can't have more than one monster roaming around London on its full moons? But that's enough of this game's story, so, with the stakes being high, how does this game play when compared to Castlevania? At first glance, this game looks and plays almost like Castlevania, but on closer inspection you can see some differences. Because of Castlevania's tight controls, you need to be familiar with not only enemy movements, but their placements as well. The reason for this is there's no way you can react quick enough with those tight controls, that is unless you know what's going to happen before it does. As much as I appreciate the tight controls and precise gameplay of Castlevania, it did at times make for a frustrating experience when you didn't know the game inside and out. And even when you do know Castlevania inside and out, the game's still hard as nails. I always thought to myself, wouldn't it be great to have the Castlevania style gameplay, but with more looser and forgiving controls? If you're in this camp, then Master of Darkness is for you. Thanks to those more looser and forgiving controls, and a plentiful supply of health potions, extra lives, weapons, and sub-weapons, Master of Darkness is what I would call a short but fair challenge. But it's such a shame you start off with that lame pocket knife that's all kinds of useless because of its short range and lack of power. It will take multiple hits close up to kill anything other than bats with the pocket knife. You'll soon find weapons that tilt the odds in your favour. The axe is the most powerful weapon in the game and will kill just about anything other than bosses in one hit, but its range is very short. There is also a sword you can collect which is less powerful but gives you greater range to attack with. And then you have the pickaxe, which is not as powerful as the axe, but it's slightly more powerful than the sword and also gives you some decent range to work with. No Castlevania clone would be complete without sub-weapons, and Master of Darkness doesn't disappoint. The most common weapon you find is the pistol, which is handy to take out guys from a distance, but it's not so useful at close range, and it takes a lot of shots to kill anything. There are also bombs which are powerful, but can be tricky to aim. Boomerangs are awesome, and sometimes you can take out 2 guys with just 1 boomerang. And then we have what looks like stakes, but according to the manual they're actually projectiles. These projectile stake thingies will hit anything in their path, and will definitely make quick work of the final boss. Another thing that sets Master of Darkness apart from Castlevania is it's set in Victorian times as opposed to 16th century Transylvania, so you're going to see plenty of decent gothic pixel art. Each of Master of Darkness's 5 levels are split into multiple stages and all end with a boss fight. Each of this game's levels are very distinct from one another, but because this game is more forgiving than Castlevania, you'll soon tear through each of them. Master of Darkness doesn't have that much music in it, but what it does have is excellent, and does a great job in getting you in the mood for Sega's Castlevania clone. It's still not a patch on Castlevania's phenomenal soundtrack, but Master of Darkness' soundtrack is still impressive by Master System standards. There's not a lot of history to this game, but what I've dug up is interesting. In different regions this game goes under different names. In Japan it's In the Wake of Vampire, in the US it's Vampire Master of Darkness, and in Europe it's simply called Master of Darkness. What's also interesting is this game was ported to Sega's Game Gear. In 1992, Master of Darkness was also released for the Game Gear. Visually this port is as faithful to the Master System game as it could be on the smaller Game Gear screen. In converting this game for the smaller screen, level layouts had to be changed. Some of these changes don't affect the gameplay too much, but some of the changes made to the levels can make this game way too hard, as there's no room to manoeuvre. Strangely, some of the changes made to Master of Darkness can make it more easier to dodge enemies on certain parts of the levels, and this is even more noticeable on the boss fights. It's such a shame the Game Gear port is so unbalanced, but with smartphones able to play all sorts of retro games, I would suggest you just stick with the Master System game. I was kind of surprised there wasn't a sequel to Master of Darkness, but then again, Sega's fortunes did, for a time, change with the Genesis, and because of this, Sega were able to get strong third-party support for their 16-bit console. So in place of Master of Darkness 2, we get an exclusive Castlevania game for the Genesis. But Bloodlines would not be the only Castlevania game released on a Sega system. There was of course Castlevania Symphony of the Night, which was sadly only released for the Japanese Sega Saturn. And we almost had Castlevania Resurrection for the Dreamcast, but that title was cancelled during development. If Sega were ever going to get a Castlevania game on their Master System, then they were going to have to make it themselves, and for the most part I think they succeeded. Master of Darkness looks like Castlevania, plays like Castlevania, but with a Sega twist. And since Konami has no more interest in making console games, let alone Castlevania games, then consider Master of Darkness for your vintage Castlevania fix. Thank you for watching.